Hi, I'm Neil.
And I'm John.
And you're listening to World of Telly, the podcast where John and I watch every single TV programme ever made in no particular order. And what are we watching this week, John?
We're watching Out.
Now, if you're not familiar with this programme, Out is a 6-part crime series which was broadcast on ITV in the summer of 1978. It was written by Trevor Preston, directed by Jim Goddard and produced by Barry Hanson. It stars Tom Bell, Brian Croucher and Brian Cox, and it's one of the first serials made by Euston Films. So before we get into the programme itself, John, what was Euston Films?
Well, Euston Films was a wholly owned subsidiary of Thames Television. Basically, it came from a time of plenty in the commercial television arena. Thames was doing very well. Some of the people within Thames, like Trevor Preston and Mike Hodges, who later directed Get Carter, worked at ABC, which was a sort of one of the companies that merged with Rediffusion to form Thames TV in the late 60s. They were used to working on documentaries and art programmes using 16mm film. And Trevor Preston wrote an experimental children's TV programme called The Tyrant King, which was directed by Mike Hodges and basically made entirely on 16mm. And then that led to a couple of one-offs called Rumour and Suspect, which were quite gritty, all-film productions to sort of test the water on how that would go. Now, Brian Tesler, who we've talked about before in the Don't Drink the Water podcast, who was a significant player at Thames TV at that point, and some people called Lloyd Shirley and George Taylor, proposed a wholly owned subsidiary company of Thames that would make all film productions. And part of the reason for doing that was that Thames had quite a bit of money at that point. It was also because of the fact that studio-based drama that was made by Thames was quite a hard sell to America, because it was on VT and America was largely film. So the idea of making film drama was much easier sell. So they proposed the idea of Euston Films. It was boringly named because Thames TV's London studio was on the Euston Road. So they literally looked out of the window and saw the street sign and said Euston Films. It was a really interesting, kind of very agile company, as they would say nowadays. It rented all of its equipment. It didn't own any of the filming equipment that it had. It initially got an okay ride from the unions, which was important, because it didn't take any work away from Thames TV studios, which were at capacity at the time. It was on top of, everything that was being filmed there. And, it wasn't unusual for a TV company to have a sort of related subsidiary company, because ATV famously had ITC, which made loads of things like The Persuaders and The Saint and those kind of programs that got flogged. But they were made more with an eye to the US market, whereas no one can accuse Euston Films of making products that weren't UK. But one of the really important things about Euston Films is that it was a really different way of making TV programs. And to do that, you had to navigate the unions. And there were 3 main unions that worked on television programs. There was the ACTT, or ACT, that was Association of Cinematographic Television and Allied Technicians, which were like production staff, like the directors and so on. There was NATCA, which was makeup, wardrobe, props. And there was EEP2, which was electricians, plumbers, ancillary workers and things like that. And it was a long tradition of kind of what was seen as being quite strict union regulations about what you could do. So things like you couldn't make changes at the last minute in terms of which personnel would be involved. You had to give plenty of notice if there was going to be a change to the shift and the way that they were worked. But this wasn't just the unions. This was because the unions in the studios worked under something called ITCA, which was the Independent Television Companies Association Agreement. And that was quite rigid and largely aimed at studio. But there was another agreement, which was the BFTPA agreement, which was under the British Film and Television Producers Association. And that was largely stemmed from the days of film productions. So there was this nice little loophole where television shows made entirely on film could be made under this other agreement, the BFTPA agreement, or BIFPA. And because it was so flexible, that flexibility allowed them to make programs on the fly, make kind of last minute decisions about things. It could have smaller crews. It also could have the same crews operating throughout programs where in the studio, from one episode to the next, it was a lottery about who you got. Whereas this allowed people to build up relationships And the crews that worked on it absolutely loved working in this way. And it led to some tensions within the union, because when things like Special Branch, and then there was a pilot armchair cinema film called Regan, which effectively ended up as being the pilot for the Sweeney. When that took off, the other union members who weren't working on those programs started to think, hang on a minute, and the union more widely thought, well, hang on a minute, what's going on here? But of course, the people who actually were working on the Sweeney didn't want their own union to kind of ruin it for them, as it were. So there was quite a lot of tension. It came to a head when, because with Special Branch was originally a VT production, and there'd been 2 series of that. And then they decided to use that as the way of testing out. It was a known property, so they basically did it on film.
The studio version starred Darren Nesbitt and the film version starred George Sewell. But apart from the title, they have nothing else in common, do they?
There's virtually no connection. There were some writers in common, like Trevor Preston, for example, but there were no characters in common. And it was just basically using a known property to see how it would work. They did that a bit later after the Sweeney had taken off, and they wanted to do it, interestingly, with Public Eye.
Oh, really?
And Alfred Burke did not like the idea of it, because one of the things that's interesting about the early days of Euston was that the nature of the way that they were making it, like they used as a base in West London, they used a disused public school, which was kind of falling to pieces. And the conditions were terrible. So the unions were a bit worried about that. You know, the toilets were bad and all of those kind of things. But it also meant it favoured certain types of drama. It favoured action sequences. It favoured scenes with 2 people in them, having arguments with a very mobile camera. That was already quite well known when they started to do it with Public Eye. And Alfred Burke didn't like the idea of it. He didn't want it to change. And actually, that could have extended Public Eye, but he decided not to do it. So they did it with Van der Valk instead. And that's when problems came to a head with the union. There were some real struggles at that point because the unions had got fed up with it. There was a real tussle over Van der Valk. And actually, if you ask the question, why didn't all ITV companies at this point do a Euston? It's because it became a hot potato. Thames got in first, effectively, with this type of kind of TV production. But at that point, the other TV companies found great difficulties with the union. And because of the politics, Lloyd Shirley and George Taylor, who were a rumbustious pair, to say the least, they didn't like the idea of this. And there was a bit of a change of the guard at Thames as well at this point. And Thames very much saw Euston as something that should be a feeder company for drama to be shown on the Thames, whereas initially Goodman and Lloyd Shirley and George Taylor maybe saw it as being a company that would make things for other companies. And because of that, they decided to move on, and into their place effectively came Johnny Goodman and obviously the well-known Verity Lambert, who was head of drama at Thames.
Never heard of her. Has she done anything else?
No, not really. She came out of nowhere. Verity Lambert came in, was already running things at Thames, and kind of took an overview at Euston, along with a very talented, she never liked to be called a script editor. This is Linda Agron. She hated being called a script editor because she couldn't bear the idea that you would rewrite writers' scripts. She guided things, she read scripts, she commissioned, and she was really excellent. The famous phrase to describe things like Special Branch and the Sweeney was kick, bollock and scramble, because that tended to sum up the kind of material that came out of there. When Verity Lambert, Johnny Goodman, Linda Agron came in, they decided they wanted to make a bit of a change, and that was when Out was commissioned.
And I believe that Verity commissioned Out from Trevor Preston after a 10-minute meeting?
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of shows you the difference, I think, between, how things were then. But even then, I think Trevor Preston was staggered, because Trevor Preston had worked on lots and lots of things. He created things like kids' TV programme Ace of Wands. I mentioned The Tyrant King. He wrote lots of individual episodes for many Thames TV programmes in particular. And he was thinking of packing in writing at the time. I think he was going to go into boat building or something like Howard's Way. But he sent the treatment into Verity Lambert. Verity Lambert met him and within 10 minutes told him, and he'd signed the papers within a week. Wow. To go ahead and do it, because she loved it so much, and let him get on with it, which was fairly classic kind of her managerial style at the time.
And am I right in thinking that Trevor Preston had worked with Jim Goddard before, the director?
Yeah, he'd worked with Goddard on a number of things, and Goddard had got a real reputation as being a really excellent director. Again, I mean, not just really in the Euston sort of scenario, in that kind of environment. He just got a reputation as being an excellent TV director. He had a sort of, a similar-ish background to Preston, and they got on very well. And again, some of the decisions that were made in a kind of normal environment, at times you would have thought a six-parter like Out might have been shared between two directors. But they made the decision to get a kind of continuity to it and a unity to it. And that went very well.
They both treated Out as a 6-hour film rather than a 6-part TV series, didn't they?
Yes, I think they did. It was filmed like that. The production blocks were like that. And as you'll see if you watch Out, the way that they used the environment of London, South London in particular, and it's certainly not like your average studio film mix, drama. The milieu is massively part of it, and a lot of that's down to Goddard's direction.
And despite the fact it's made by the same company who made The Sweeney, and also written by a guy who wrote several episodes of The Sweeney, it feels nothing like that series, does it? Out has a unique feel and tone to it, I think.
It has, and that was noticed at the time, and I think it's often described as a sort of art house gangster movie. There are things about it, the visuals, but also some of the characterizations, and indeed some of the dialogue. One thing is very different. It's apples and oranges to an extent. Sweeney does one thing, but Out is, I think, definitely more ambitious. It's whether or not it kind of hits some of those, that some of those ambitions are seen through is probably a bigger question.
And the producer was Barry Hansen. I guess he was most well known at this point for The Naked Civil Servant, and hadn't he worked with David Rose as well?
Yeah, he worked at Pebble Mill. We've talked about him. He worked on Gangsters, the original Play for Today, wasn't it, that he was the producer of. But we talked about David Rose on several previous podcasts, particularly, I guess, Artemis 8-1. It was that great desire that they had in those days to bring together the kind of Play for Today, the writing, the quality, the interest of something like that alongside the French Connection.
Yeah, they all wanted to remake the French Connection, didn't they?
They all wanted to, yeah, absolutely. They all wanted to get that kind of visual, and as we'll talk about, there were other art house movies that they wanted to reference as well. It was to get a popular version of that kind of art house mainstream action, and basically one of the great things that happened with Barry Hansen is that ATV, we've already mentioned ATV had ITC, but they wanted a bit of the Euston pie as well, and they set up a company called Black Lion Films. Barry Hansen wanted to do a play called The Paddy Factor, which Black Lion Films were going to make because Euston didn't want it. Verity Lambert didn't like the script, and along it went to Black Lion Films, started to be made, and Lou Grade got cold feet, and that ended up being The Long Good Friday.
Yeah, you can definitely sense some echoes of Out in The Long Good Friday. It's got that similar kind of atmosphere to it. Am I also right in thinking that Out was the first TV drama to feature a villain as a protagonist?
If you think about some LWT ones, I think Villains is an interesting one from the early 70s.
Yeah, that's an anthology though, isn't it? Yeah.
Well, it follows a plot because they're all the villains that have been involved in a particular robbery. It doesn't follow a particular protagonist, but I think Trevor Preston's view was very much that there are too many programs where the hero is a goody two-shoes, or you're following the police and it's police procedural. Why can't you have something where you acknowledge that the criminal has a family, has responsibilities, and that I think certainly in the way it's done in Out, I can't remember one off the top of my head that had been done with such detail and with such a lot of kind of powerful, kind of problematic depictions. There's no easy way through Out, I think, in terms of the kind of consequences of actions, and also, of course, including lots of very compromised policemen as well. You
couldn't accuse it of glamorizing crime. All the criminals are really miserable.
Yeah, exactly. It's like everything is miserable about it. I think Clive James in one of his reviews said something about everybody reeks of bad diet. I thought it was quite a funny one. Yeah, there's no glamour involved in it. There's nothing is glamorized about it. It's got this kind of extreme atmosphere to it. It's got this weird combination, and this is where you get into the kind of art house and the sort of gangster and the sort of slice of life stuff. You've got this kind of extreme emotion in it, as well as the sort of mundanity of what is going on as well.
Mm-hmm. There aren't many laughs in Out.
No, I think we need to tell people that, yeah, there's very few, and I think Tom Bell smiles twice.
Hello? Hello, Mr. Wilson. I just thought you'd like to know Frank Ross is out.
Now, the plot of Out revolves around a character called Frank Ross, who's just been released from prison for 8 years for robbing a bank. He's caught red-handed.
Yeah.
And he comes out of prison, and the entire series is set up with this mystery of who grassed him up to the police. Why did he go inside? And he becomes obsessed. Now, the person playing Frank Ross is Tom Bell.
Oh, Tom Bell, incredible actor and a really odd career. He got a real name for himself. He was in a TV pinter play called A Night Out, which was an armchair theatre on ITV, which got massive ratings and huge acclaim. And then he started off with his film career, and he was in a film called The L-Shaped Room, which involved Richard Attenborough, Brian Forbes, Leslie Caron, I think it was, and he was expected to be huge on the back of that. The first of the missteps in Tom Bell's career was that they had a sort of gala lunch about it with the Duke of Edinburgh addressing them, and unfortunately Tom Bell, which is fairly common for him, got pissed and started heckling the Duke of Edinburgh, and he particularly said, tell us a joke, he kept saying, or him, Tom Bell was saying, tell us a joke. And apparently Prince Philip said, if you wanted a comedian, you should have hired one. And, he kind of bounced back quite well from it, but everybody else was horrified, and it really did his career in quite badly in films. I mean, it was front page of some newspapers. His career became fitful. He always made, he continued to make interesting films. I think things start to pick up in the early 70s. He was in the Potter play Angels Us Few. He was in the Polyakov play for today with Francesca Annis called Stronger Than the Sun, about a nuclear power station, which is fantastic. And around the time he was in Out, the famous American drama Holocaust, he played Eichmann in it. That's sort of where we'd got to. He was a name. People in Britain would know him. But he continued to work, but he'd not had the stellar arc that everybody predicted around the time of The L-Shaped Room.
He was nominated for a BAFTA for this, wasn't he?
Yeah, and I think quite rightly, it's it's an incredible performance. I mean, one of the great things about it is you can, there's some very funny stories about the way he was in it. I mean, difficult person to work with, very exacting. He wasn't happy if anybody was slacking. And he just had this intensity. If his intensity as Frank Ross was anything like his intensity in real life, you'd just be terrified of him.
The opening moments in particular, when he takes the train into London and he starts to have a panic attack, and it's done so subtly behind the eyes, and he is, like you say, terrifying in this series.
Yeah, it's the kind of stillness of him. It's astonishing, particularly at the beginning when he goes to his house in this big, horrible kind of empty barn-like house in Tulse Hill, I think it is. There's this great thing, and again, this is getting into Jim Goddard's direction, but Jim Goddard had this instruction that you shouldn't be able to see out of the windows from inside. He bleached the windows out with powerful light, so it's got this really odd interiors. But there's times when people kind of come around, and he's standing in the middle of the room. And you sort of get the impression with Frank Ross that if people kind of go out and leave him there, he just stands there staring in his three-piece suit in this kind of incredible intensity.
Wasn't there a disastrous publicity tour for Out?
Yeah, this is interesting. When I was looking back through the newspaper archive, I wasn't actually aware of this until recently. There was a couple of weird things about it. Thames did this publicity campaign on the tubes in London, and they put posters up saying Frank Ross is out.
It's like a viral thing, wasn't it?
Yeah, and not long before that, there was a famous graffiti campaign about a real-life person called George Davis, and it was George Davis is innocent. He was a criminal who'd supposed to have a miscarriage of justice. He got actually released in the end, and then promptly, within a year, got done for robbing again. The London Underground and London Transport didn't like it at all, so that caused a problem. But apparently Thames decided it would be a good idea, because Tom Bell's from Liverpool, I believe, and they thought it would be a good idea to tour the north. And he hated interviews. Some of the interviews are actually in the newspapers where he's quite taciturn, but it's referred to later that this was the straw that broke the camel's back. And it's almost certainly the reason why he decided he wasn't going to do another series, if indeed another series had been planned, which is slightly uncertain, but we'll get onto that, I'm sure.
We'll get there.
He was a very easy person to piss off, basically. And I think they really did themselves no favours by doing this tour, because it was just like, like herding a very angry, intense cat.
It's like herding Frank Ross around.
Yeah, exactly. There's very little difference, I think, between the two at that point.
I thought you might change, but your sort never do.
My sort? What do you know about my sort?
All I need to, all I can stomach.
Nothing. I eat in the nick without visitors. Even on segregation, I was never as lonely, as isolated as you are. You got no one. No wife, kids, no real friends. You got nothing but the job. The people aren't people to you. They're times, numbers, places in diaries.
I'll give you a few weeks before you're back inside. Or dead.
Who else have we got in this? I guess the biggest name is probably Brian Cox in one of his earlier roles. He's really good.
He is, but he decides to act as a character called McGrath with a speech impediment. And he's also got extraordinary blonde hair, which is a legacy from the role he'd done previously. But I mean, of course, that's interesting because it's obviously so huge now.
And then we've got another Brian Croucher, who plays Frank Ross's best friend.
Yeah, and the occasions you sometimes see Frank smile it was when Crouch's character Chris. He obviously just really dotes on Chris, and it's quite interesting. But also partly because in the program, Chris has bankrupted himself, keeping Frank's. We'll get onto this. Frank's wife, who's got mental health problems, in a suitable place, a suitable hospital. This was the first thing I ever saw Brian Croucher in, because I'll get onto this later. I saw Out several times when I was a kid. And Brian Croucher, I literally, when he was in Blake 7, it was it's that guy from Out. That's what I remember. He was literally the first thing. And I thought Croucher's good in this.
When I was watching it, I kept thinking, why would anybody think that he would be a good fit for a sort of space assassin? It just doesn't make any sense. He's like a Jack the Lad, South London wide boy, isn't he?
But there's a weird bit about that, isn't there? Shall I get into that now, about the coincidence of Travises?
Yes, 2 Travises.
I've been at several conventions where they've had Stephen Greif, who was the first Travis, and he's told, once prompted by me, the story about one of his biggest disappointments was how he missed out on a role in Out. And in fact, it's the Brian Marshall role of the former policeman that he missed out on. And he missed out on it for the same reason that he's not in some of the filming for the last episode of the first series of Blake 7, because he injured himself playing squash.
That's right, yeah.
And he was begging Jim Goddard and Trevor Preston to write it into the part because he could barely walk, and he was saying he can limp, it'll be great, he can limp. But the thing that's interesting is that Stephen, we've mentioned The Long Good Friday, Stephen Grafe, he blamed it on not getting that part because then Brian Marshall got a part in The Long Good Friday.
That's right, yes.
And he's convinced if he'd have had this part in Out, he would have been in A Long Good Friday. And he was really, I wouldn't say bitter about it, but he really rued it. He really did. But it's so strange that he then left Blake 7, and Brian Croucher, who was in Out, then weirdly, as you say, got cast in Blake 7 for no good reason.
Would have been interesting to see him in that part, but Brian Marshall's so good in it, I couldn't imagine it going
Yeah,
any
he's
other
great.
way.
He's so good at playing that sort of venal, corrupted character, isn't he? Where sweaty kind of guy who's just caught out all the time, and is kind of, there's bigger players around, and he's this weak kind of man. He's exactly the same as a counsellor in Long Good Friday.
Well, here's something that should crack that face. Frankie Ross is on to Simmy Vincent. I thought that might amuse you.
Are you sure?
He's out there now looking for that other slag I mate.
Angela Reese.
Right.
She knows nothing.
How do you know? You only met her
And
once.
Simmy Vincent's in Australia.
That were 8 years
She
ago.
wouldn't come back.
Well, let's hope you're right. Just to make sure, I want you to take it on your arches and have a little heart-to-heart with Miss Bangor.
I don't know where she lives.
Here's her address. Ex-detective.
I think the best moment for Brian Croucher is when he's beaten up by the least likely person ever.
That's Norman Eshley, and Norman Eshley died yesterday.
You're joking? What?
No.
From George and Mildred?
Yeah, Jeffrey Fourmile. Because he's in an episode of The Sweeney, great episode of The Sweeney, where he plays an ultimately cowardly police officer. But no, he plays it's a brilliant idea. He plays the bailiff who's trying to get the money from Brian Croucher. And Brian Croucher, who gets a bit pissed and thinks this guy, Norman Eshley, Geoffrey Fourmile, is going to be a weakling. And he gets his head kicked in by him, basically.
It's the closest you get to comedy.
Yes.
For a moment there, Brussel, I thought you were being serious.
No, I never joke when money is concerned.
You polisher.
You're out of condition, Mr. Cotton.
You bastard!
It also features a performance from someone we've spoken about at length. Linda Plante's in this.
She is.
She plays an escort, doesn't she? A Welsh escort.
I think it's Welsh. I think it's quite an accent. Yeah, she's in it. I'd forgotten that she was in it because the whole episode's called A Little Word with, what is it, Miss Wales or something like that, isn't it? The
Miss
episode's
Bangor.
called Miss Bangor.
Yeah.
That's right. And she plays a fairly pivotal role in it because she puts them in touch with someone who was a girlfriend of one of the members of the Frank Ross's gang. And of course, what happened later is that one of the other roles that Tom Bell's so famous for and remembered for is in Prime Suspect, where he plays the initially extremely hostile policeman who works with Jane Tennyson, Helen Mirren's character, but then goes on to actually develop much more of a relationship with her as time goes on. It's an interesting thing about both, I think, Euston Films, but also Verity Lambert and Linda Agron, that they were up for anything. You know, they get a script coming in from someone who's played effectively bit parts in the programs that were there. They didn't make any judgments about it. Their only judgment was whether it was any good or not. And you see that with Preston, you see that with Linda LaPlante.
Hello, Kath. I've just had a visit from Frank Ross. Yeah, he's out.
Now, before we go any further, because we're getting into spoiler territory, I think we need to tell our listeners if they want to watch out, because we are going to spoil the ending. Where can they watch it, John?
It's available now on Amazon Prime. Certainly in the UK, I can't swear for the US, but it's in a very nice HD version.
Yeah, it's only £10 for the whole series.
Yeah, and it's worth it because not long before, sadly, they folded, Network brought it out on Blu-ray, but I think it might have been the last thing they brought out. So it had quite a truncated release. So it's definitely worth watching. It's a very nice version of it anyway.
High definition grime.
Yes, you can see every bit of dust and grit and slime in the pub. You just see everything.
How many bank accounts did you open, Roy? How many fat brown envelopes did you find in your smother when you left the restaurant or a club? Did he make Bryce have a flat up McGrath's arse too?
No.
No? Oh, no, not Brycey. He wouldn't take a bottle of cooking sherry at Christmas, would he? But he sussed you, didn't he, eh? What did he say when he found out that you'd been on the bung from Tony McGrath ever since you put your funny out in the bottom drawer, eh?
Okay, let's dig into some of the specifics of the plot of Out, because it's not just about the mystery of who grassed up Frank Ross. It's also primarily concerned with the effect it had on his family, who are dysfunctional, to put it mildly.
Yeah, they are. And I think this is where there's an interesting conversation to be had, I think, because there's a number of areas for this because of the fact that the second episode, basically the first episode is Frank, as you say, coming out of prison. He has a panic attack when he encounters crowds at the station he comes in London. He has a kind of slightly bewildering and alienating trip in the taxi with Terry from Fawlty Towers, the chef, who's the taxi driver. And he goes through London. Of course, London's very different. He's been away for whatever it is that he's been away for. He arrives back at his house. He then immediately gets pounced on by the police for breaking in to his own house because the locks have been changed. What you immediately know from Frank is that Chris, the Brian Crouch character, Chris, his friend, is explaining that, his son's a little bit off the rails at the moment and that his wife is still in a mental hospital. But Frank's first concern is finding out who grassed him up. There's no pause. There's nothing. He's basically an avenging angel.
Yeah.
Right from the start, and nothing will knock him off the path. And the thing that's interesting about Out, I think, is that there's a lot of things about, and it's great and it's very well done about, that Frank going to prison didn't just put him in prison for all this time. It ruined his family's life. His family were destroyed. His wife was destroyed. His mistress was destroyed by it. He was such a, this kind of imposing character that everything falls apart when he's not there. But when he comes out, rectifying that is only one of his objectives. His main objective is finding out who grassed him up. And he's straight into it. He changes into a better suit than the one he had in prison. And he's straight out. And he's pained by the fact that his friend is going bankrupt because of the fact he's had to pay for all of the hospital fees because the money that he left wasn't enough. So it's all very effective. And it's great because you don't get much in Sweeney of people concerned about the wife and the kids. Of course, the problem of this, and it starts with, the second episode starts with him visiting his wife in the home, and it's distressing. The whole scene is very distressing.
She's schizophrenic, isn't she, I think?
Yeah. And there's all sorts of stuff going on later that she couldn't bear to see her son because she was attracted to him, because she reminded him of...
Good Lord.
Yeah, and it's full of all this stuff. The problem with it, in terms of, yes, it's good that Preston's bringing all this stuff into it, but you also mean that the women involved, like the mistress and the wife, are just basically nothing on their own. They have no agency. They're waiting for Frank to come back. Okay, it's about a very male world, and it's about a very male milieu. It goes a step further in some ways. That at least, thinking about the consequences of the action of the Euston hard man. But it's also necessarily, I think, for the time, and also the kind of writer that Trevor Preston was, it's limited.
I thought you were dead. I saw your card. I thought you were dead.
What's she doing here? What do you think, you bastard? We've both been going out of our minds. Your motor blown to pieces, the law banging at the door. We didn't know if you was alive or dead. You could have contacted one of us.
You've got to stop, Frank. You've got to stop before you are killed.
She's right, Frank. I can't, not now. I'm too close. That's the closest you're ever going to get to finding yourself dead. Now, what's happened? Why is the scream on for you?
Look, I haven't got time. Now, you get back to the flat. No one knows about it but us. Now, you stay with her and make sure you're not followed.
But, Frank, just do it!
Don't, Frank, don't go!
Chris will look after you. I'll see you later.
No, Frank, no!
Easy, love.
For me, I enjoyed it immensely, but I feel it's let down slightly by the fact that this central mystery that's set up, who grassed on Frank, it's very underwhelming. It's not very satisfactory. I was hoping it might be somebody he knew really well, like Chris. It turns out it's just another criminal, and it's nothing personal, and they barely know each other.
The thing that's interesting is that there's this sort of, I think it's quite bizarre now. You look back on it retrospectively, there's a sort of myth, and it may be true, that apparently on the day that episode 6 aired, the final episode, on railway stations, the newspaper sellers were putting up posters saying, "This is who grassed Frank Ross." Well, you knew who grassed Frank Ross in episode 4.
Yeah, if you've been paying attention.
It's the Brian Cox character, McGrath. And it's as good as blatant. I think the thing that is the bit that probably is the interesting bit is more about, and this is what Trevor Preston says, that it's actually about the corruption of the police officer. We didn't mention, actually, Norman Rodway.
Yeah, he's great.
He's very good in it. He plays a very kind of morally upstanding policeman, but he's allowed his hatred of Ross to corrupt him.
Yeah.
It's about the corrosive nature of revenge, hatred. And I think it's effective in that way. But the way that they deal with it, and I think there are some really interesting things about exactly what you talk about, the sense of anticlimax. Certainly when I watched it for the first time when I was a kid, and even when it was repeated the following year, we were all labouring under the misapprehension there was going to be a second series. And I'd not seen it in the newspapers that they'd said there wasn't going to be one.
I think it's clearly designed for a second series because the last episode ends with Brian Cox basically saying, "I want Frank Ross dead," and it ends with Frank Ross going, "I'm going to kill McGraw," and that's it. It just ends, and it's like, where is that sequel? It's very, very disappointing.
I've never seen it actually confirmed completely that it was just Tom Bell, and it frustrates the hell out of me that they had a bloody commentary on the DVD of Out, and they don't even mention it, which is just baffling. I like the fact that it's about where you get nowhere with your obsessive hatred, because the copper, I've forgotten his name, Bryce, isn't it? Yeah. The Norman Rodway character, he is completely undone by the fact he decided it was more important for him to get Frank Ross and then leave McGrath to become a massive gangster and have something over on him and let his mate Brian Marshall off, even though he hated him because he was a corrupt officer. And that's actually quite effective.
I think the most surprising thing for me about the resolution to Out is what happens to the detective that's working with Bryce. I mean, when you first meet him, he comes across as very aggressive. If it turned out that he was a bent copper, you wouldn't raise an eyebrow. But it turns out that he's the only one in the story that's got, the moral centre, and he's the one who sends Bryce down. And I found that very surprising and didn't expect it.
Yeah, and it works because he effectively sets him up as well, doesn't he? Just to kind of prove. And he hates working with Frank Ross to do it, and says to him, he's nicked more criminals than anybody else, but he still can't let him get away with it. By the way, I'd forgotten to mention there's the stillness and the quietness of Tom Bell acting as Frank Ross. They often struggled to pick him up on the mics because he speaks so quietly. Yeah. And that was his thing. He really did. That's quite a modern thing, I think, as well now, isn't it? Yeah. That kind of thing. Rob Walker, who played the copper you're talking about, Alec Rimmer, there's a scene, I think it's in the last episode, where Tom Bell's sitting in the driving seat of the car and Rob Walker sitting next to him. Tom Bell gave his line and he was so quiet that Rob Walker didn't pick up on the cue. And he said, and he just said, "Oh, Tom, sorry, I didn't pick up on that. I didn't quite hear it." And Tom Bell just said, "That's as loud as I get."
You're mad, Ross. You're insane. Is that what all this is about? You get yourself blown to pieces for the name of a snout? You got a sick wife, a son, a stink of a nick on you, and all you care about is some pathetic little hound 9 years ago who grassed you for a few quid.
I think the frustrating thing is that there is a confrontation between Brian Cox and Tom Bell, and it's so good, but then it's suddenly, in a flash, it's over, and you just want to see these two going at it for another 6 episodes.
Yeah, this is a brilliant scene, and I can't believe I've forgotten his name momentarily, the other actor who's in that, who I absolutely love.
Derek O'Connor.
Derek O'Connor, absolutely brilliant actor, went on to be, went out to Hollywood and did very well over there.
He was in Lethal Weapon 3, wasn't he?
Yeah, he is, yeah, or 2 maybe. Is it with Joss Ackland, Diplomatic Immunity? I think it's that one. It's just such an intense scene. I know what you mean about it being an anticlimax, but I think that really plays into that idea of it being very much like a non-typical drama on TV at that time, and more into that sort of art house territory where you don't get the payoff. The other thing you get is Tom Bell, Frank Ross doesn't kill anyone.
No.
He doesn't kill anyone. He beats a few people up. But, so you end it with this thing that the Avenging Angel has not actually even killed a single person during the whole thing, which is quite weird as well.
There's not a lot of action in the programme. I think there's one explosion, and that's about it, isn't it?
Yes, where you have the crazy bespectacled hitman, who's a very creepy kind of character. But yeah,
He looks like an accountant, doesn't he? Yeah. Yeah. Something else I found interesting about the ending is when Frank confronts Bryce and sort of revels in the fact that he's going to send this bent copper to prison. But the fact of the matter is that Frank wasn't innocent. He wasn't sent down because he'd been set up or framed. He was caught red-handed. And when Bryce explains to him why he did what he did, you kind of appreciate his position. You can sort of know where he's coming from. His job is to get people like Frank off the streets. So it's whether the ends justify the means. But yeah, it's a fantastic programme.
The police officers, not social workers. Not gutless magistrates, not Hampstead radicals. They know. So does the man in the street. Protection. That's what he wants. Protection. For his family, his property. Order. Order. My job is to bury rubbish like you out of sight. You offend them. And they don't really care how I do it.
Oh, you're wrong. They care, most of them, they care.
It's war. They know it's war.
The critical reaction was incredibly good for it. It really went down very well indeed. Some people didn't like the fact that it was like, I don't care about someone like Frank Ross. He's a criminal. Why should I care about him? And there was a bit of that. The reputation grew so much. It was repeated the following year because Jeremy Isaacs, who went on to run Channel 4, was in charge at Thames when it was made, and he couldn't wait to get it on Channel 4 in the early days of Channel 4.
They repeated it a lot, didn't they?
They repeated Out, they repeated the Fox, which was Trevor Preston's next series. And its reputation grew, and I just have a kind of anecdote about this. A friend of mine in the 90s got a job at the BFI, in the BFI Publishing. And it was around the time that the BFI were compiling a top 100 TV programmes or something like that. And bless him, my friend, he was A lovely guy, but he didn't, at one point he didn't know that much about films, and he certainly didn't know much about TV. And he was sitting in this meeting, and one of them said, "Oh yes, well, we've got to have Out in there. Out's got to be right up as high as possible." And this was 90s. And Rob leaned over my friend and said, "What's Out?" And this guy just looked at him like he'd kind of farted, and looked at him and just said, "Just the best program ever made." So it kind of had this really elevated reputation, and I think partly it's just to do with the fact that at that time you thought people were settling down to know what Euston Films was and those kind of programs, and then you got Out, and it's a kind of like all scripts written by the same guy. It's an authored piece. It's directed by the same director all the way through. It's got a strong visual style. It's got this kind of, both of them, Goddard and Preston, are obsessed with the Alain Delon film Le Samurai. And if you watch Le Samurai, you'll see a huge number of echoes of the way that Out is done. Again, it's this besuited kind of, still silent figure who's going around. So it's very unusual in that respect. And I still think it's a very distinctive piece of work now.
What were the viewing figures like?
The viewing figures were okay. It got in the top 20 a few times, and I think top 10. But the one of the ironies is that people were, even the newspapers were saying, everybody's desperate to see the final episode. Now, not to find out who the grass was, because as far as I'm concerned, you'd already found it out. But to find out how it ended. But then, ironically, the last episode didn't make the top 20. So if they were particularly bothered about it, they didn't turn up. And another thing about it that's interesting, and this goes for a lot of Thames stuff, the really groundbreaking Thames stuff like Bill Brand, Rock Follies and things like that often used to get put out in the summer because, that was the least competitive time. And, of course, Out was put out there. So I think that shows there was a certain kind of hesitation about it.
I think the last episode went out on a bank holiday Monday, which probably didn't.
No, that's true. But the fact that it went out in the summer meant that because my parents were incredibly liberal about letting me stay up as long as there wasn't school the next day, because it was on in the summer, I watched every episode of it when I was whatever I was, 10, something like that. Then it was repeated the next year at Easter. So I managed to get to see it then as well. And then it was on in Channel 4 in the early 80s. So I ended up without video seeing it several times, which again is probably why it stuck in my mind so much. And it was a big popular one with my family as well. We all loved Tom Bell, even though he was just terrifying.
One thing I'd like to say as well is the theme music is a banger by George Fenton.
Fantastic. The incidental music is just brilliant as well. All of the music is fantastic in it. And it's when it kicks in at the end of the episode.
Yeah, it's brilliant.
It's visceral, isn't it? It's just, and I love the sepia-drenched tones of the and the bleached out stuff of the flashbacks, and then they use the still images from that over the end credits. Yeah, it's just great.
So what did Trevor Preston end up doing after this?
Well, Preston straight away got commissioned by, I think, basically Verity Lambert said, "What else have you got?" And he came up with a few ideas. And she went with Fox, which is the story of, he said it was like the Forsyte saga in Clapham. And that was a long 13-episoder, which again was directed by Jim Goddard and again directed like a film. And I think it's Preston's best thing. It has its drawbacks, as I think you found out. The songs, it's kind of like he's
weird
got
songs,
strange songs in it. But it's a very non-typical TV series with a very sprawling cast of characters. And I thought that was particularly good. But then Preston had quite a lot of difficulty after that, really.
He did Billy the Kid versus the Green Bay's Vampires.
Yeah, Alan Clark directed that, didn't he? And he did various series things like Ruth Rendell Mysteries, but he didn't really get the opportunity to do, the kind of creative original work. Because I was struck by him when he talks about when he did Out and he did Fox. He said he'd earned the right at that point to do original work because he'd really put in the hours on things like Callan, Sweeney, and those kind of things. And then TV changed. And he just didn't really get those opportunities. Again, he did a film later in life. He had a bit of a comeback because Mike Hodges, who we mentioned, who was a colleague of Preston's from the very early days of ABC and Thames, he did a film called I'll Sleep When I'm Dead. But that was sort of it, really, for Preston. And I know he suffered from depression badly. It was his high watermark, I think, out on Fox in terms of original work.
And what about Goddard?
Well, Goddard did some really interesting stuff. He did. It's kind of checkered in the sense that he did black stuff, which led to Boys from the Black Stuff. And, as I mentioned, Fox, he did that sprawling version of The Life and Adventures of Nicholas Nickleby, which was premiered on Channel 4. He did some of Riley Ace of Spies, which was another Euston production, along with Martin Campbell, who was the other director on that, just before Martin Campbell did Edge of Darkness. Can you remember the Kennedy thing about Kennedy with Martin Sheen? That was a kind of co-production. And he worked again with Trevor Preston. I'd forgotten, there's this obscure film he did called Parker, with Brian Brown in it. But then the really weird bit that happened was he did his big Hollywood film was Shanghai Surprise, which was the famous Madonna, Sean Penn disaster. And then he moved back into TV and did, again, police procedurals, kind of series work, even EastEnders at one point.
And what happened to Euston Films?
Euston Films, their big thing that they got, because they used to obviously call the Sweeney their banker, and they got another banker. They got Minder, and Minder was their big thing because it's a fairly obvious thing to do. That if you have something that's guaranteed to keep being made, make the money, get shown on a regular basis, you can experiment with other things. And so it was very important that they got Minder. I mean, Verity Lambert and Linda Agren were quite keen to not disassociate themselves from the Sweeney, but show that Euston Films could do other things. So they did the John Mills Quatermass. They did Widows, Riley Ace of Spies, we've just mentioned. And it sort of went on for a while, but it survived the Thames losing its franchise in sort of late 80s, early 90s, carried on making Minder. But then once Minder finished, that was the end of Euston Films.
That was it.
That was it. I think it was owned by, I think they made it for Central TV at that point, but it just sort of died after that.
Is that when it wasn't Dennis Waterman, it was somebody else?
Yeah, I can't remember Gary someone. I can't remember the name of the character. But the thing about Euston is that it sort of really set the model for what you have in TV now. It's that kind of, you have, small production companies making these programs, allowing writers to kind of, to do creative work. And it was massively influential as an organisation. And as an initial experiment, it really flourished.
You grassy bastard.
It was Bryce, not me. Bryce! He just used me, Frank. He used me to get to you.
Yeah. I bet he really had to give you a hard sell too, didn't he?
I didn't want no part of it. On my mother's eyes.
What a chance for an ambitious dog like you, Tony, eh? What a stitch-up. You walk away from a sure 10 stretch and do up Frankie Ross. You couldn't resist it, could you? And no one knew. All those years, no one knew who or why. Hate. That's the only thing that's kept me going, hate.
Okay, before we go, just a few words about the schedule for World of Telly. John and I have made some massive inroads into looking at every single TV programme ever made, and we don't want to finish too soon. So we're taking a short break, and the next episode will be in 4 weeks' time instead of the usual 2. And the programme we'll be looking at in 4 weeks' time is The Mad Deaf, a lovely drama about rabies.
Yeah, it's a fun story of rabies, and it has Ed Bishop of UFO fame in it.
Yeah, so if you've got any thoughts on The Mad Deaf, maybe some memories that you'd like to share with us.
Any family members died of rabies, that kind of thing, just let us know.
Yeah, just let us know via Blue Sky or maybe on the YouTube video if you can, and we'll read out the best comments on the next podcast. And until then, I've been Neil.
And I've been John.
And you've been listening to The World of Telly.
Goodbye from the world of telly.
I want to kill you so bad I can taste it.